Well, there were rumors. Some people said it was someone who could have been related to the Blackwell family by blood. A cousin, maybe. It's all quite vague. But I seem to remember someone mentioning the name Soames. Beatrice Soames. He glanced at Miss Marple for a reaction, as if he weren't sure if he should have said that. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, but she remained composed. Beatrice Soames, you say? Interesting. She let the name sit in the air, her mind turning over the implications. Beatrice Soames had always seemed like an odd figure in the Blackwell household. Too quiet, too out of place. But could she have been more than just a companion? Could she have had a claim to the Blackwell estate? The idea gnawed at Miss Marple like a dog worrying over a bone. "And you don't think it was ever confirmed?" Miss Marple asked, though she already knew the answer. "No one ever took the matter further?" The vicar sighed, leaning back in his chair. "The family kept it quiet. The birth was never officially recognized. I believe the Blackwells did everything they could to keep it out of the public eye. After all, a scandal like that would have destroyed their standing." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind still working. Beatrice Soames. The name had haunted her from the beginning. From the moment she first noticed how Beatrice seemed to drift on the outskirts of the Blackwell family, always present but never fully involved. If the rumors were true and Miss Marple suspected they were, then Beatrice Soames might be more connected to the estate than anyone had realized. And if she was connected to the inheritance in some way, then it was possible that she stood to gain from Sir Roger's death. The timing, the secrecy, the unexplained behaviors, it was all starting to make sense. "I think I've taken enough of your time, Vicar," Miss Marple said, rising from her chair. "But you've been most helpful. A great deal of useful information, if I may say so." The vicar nodded, still looking uncertain. "I only wish I could offer more, Miss Marple. It's a matter that's been buried for a long time, and most of the people involved are long gone. Still, if, there's anything else you need, I'll be in touch, I'm sure," Miss Marple interrupted, a polite smile on her lips. She was already heading for the door. As she stepped out into the evening air, her thoughts were racing. Beatrice Soames, an illegitimate child of the Blackwell family. It was a lead that couldn't be ignored. But was Beatrice the key to the mystery, or just another piece of the puzzle? The timing, too, seemed to fit too neatly. Beatrice's sudden discomfort around the estate, her odd behavior, the way she had avoided direct questions. It all pointed toward her having something to hide. Perhaps more than anyone else. Miss Marple knew there was still more to uncover, but the threads were becoming clearer now. Frederick Blackwell with his desperation and his quarrel with Sir Roger, Constance Blackwell with her carefully maintained airs and her hidden anxieties, Beatrice Soames with her quiet demeanor and the whispered rumors of her true identity. The estate's inheritance had started it all, and the letter had sealed the fate of those involved. But the truth was coming closer, and Miss Marple was ready for it. She only had to wait for the right moment to pull the final thread. The evening air had turned brisk, and the usual quiet hum of the village seemed louder tonight, as if the secrets it carried had begun to settle into the streets and linger in the corners of every shadow. Said Mary Mead, despite its tranquility, it was always one step away from an explosion, and Miss Marple knew it. She had seen it all before, the polite fronts people wore, the small, inevitable cracks that showed when they thought no one was looking. Tonight, as she made her way toward Wyvern House once again, she could feel that familiar tension building. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, but Miss Marple knew there was one last thread that had to be pulled before it all came apart. The part-time housekeeper at Wyvern House, Mrs. Potter, was more than just a servant. She was a watcher, the kind of woman who noticed everything but kept her observations close to her chest. She had worked at Wyvern House for years, and her loyalty to the Blackwell family had always seemed unwavering. But as Miss Marple had learned long ago, loyalty could be a fragile thing. When secrets were involved, Mrs. Potter was waiting for her in the small, dimly lit kitchen when Miss Marple arrived. The housekeeper was sitting at the table, hands folded in her lap, her eyes trained on the window as if waiting for something or someone to come into view. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice quiet, almost nervous. "I've been thinking about what happened that day, about Sir Roger's death, and there's something I think you should know." Miss Marple took a seat opposite her, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. She knew the housekeeper had something to say, and this time Miss Marple was ready for it. "What is it, Mrs. Potter?" she asked, her tone light but insistent. "Anything you can tell me could help, you know." Mrs. Potter shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "It was Frederick," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "He was the one who insisted on making the tea for Sir Roger that afternoon. I found it odd, you see. Sir Roger was never one for tea, always whiskey. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it seems strange, doesn't it?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed gave the suspicion weight. "Quite strange indeed," she replied, her voice low. "And when did this happen exactly?" Mrs. Potter folded her hands tightly in front of her. "Shortly before Sir Roger was found. I was in the kitchen preparing the evening meal. Frederick had been in the drawing-room with Sir Roger earlier, and when he came out he said he'd made the tea himself." She hesitated, looking down. "And after Sir Roger was found dead, I noticed Frederick going through the desk drawers, rummaging through papers. He seemed frantic. I didn't think much of it then either, but now I wonder." Miss Marple allowed a pause, letting the weight of the housekeeper's words settle between them. "And did he find anything, Mrs. Potter? Did you see what he was looking for?" The housekeeper shook her head, her expression tight. "I didn't see what he was looking for, but he kept muttering about a letter. I assumed it was something Sir Roger had left for him, but now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple rose from her seat, her mind racing. "Thank you, Mrs. Potter. That was very helpful. I believe I now understand what happened that afternoon." The housekeeper didn't seem entirely convinced, but she nodded anyway, watching Miss Marple leave with a look of concern on her face. As Miss Marple walked back through the garden, her steps slow and deliberate, the pieces began to fit together in her mind. The tea, Frederick's insistence on preparing it, the strange urgency with which he had rummaged through Sir Roger's desk. It all pointed to one thing. Frederick Blackwell had a clear motive and a perfect opportunity. The timing had been critical. Sir Roger had been alone when he drank the tea, and the poison, slow-acting and insidious, had taken its time to work. But it was clear to Miss Marple now, the letter, the one that had caused all the trouble, was at the center of it. If Frederick had known that Sir Roger's death could unearth the truth about the inheritance, it would have been enough to push him over the edge. Frederick had known about the letter. He had known that it could ruin everything. His claim to the estate, his future, all of it rested on the letter being destroyed. Sir Roger, in his arrogance, had left it to be found, and Frederick, desperate, had seen an opportunity to remove the one obstacle standing between him and everything he thought he was owed. The tea, Miss Marple thought, had been the perfect vehicle. Frederick had taken the time to prepare it, knowing that Sir Roger, in his usual routine, wouldn't suspect a thing. The whiskey was always his drink of choice. Tea, that was something new. But that was the brilliance of it, the simplicity. Tea could be disguised with ease. The poison could slip in unnoticed, now Miss Marple was sure of it. Frederick had the strongest motive and the best opportunity. His desperation, his need for validation, had driven him to commit a crime he never imagined he'd have to resort to. But Miss Marple wasn't ready to declare the case closed just yet. There was one more thing she needed, a final piece of evidence that would tie it all together and ensure no innocent party was implicated. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple sat by her window, the village now quiet save for the occasional murmur of conversation in the streets. The clues had all pointed to Frederick, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the truth was never quite so simple. She would wait. The final piece was out there somewhere, and once it was in her hands, the case would be solved. But for now, all she could do was watch and listen, letting the puzzle fall into place, piece by piece. And as always, Miss Marple knew that the truth, though slow in coming, would find its way to the surface in time. It always did. Chapter 5. a carefully orchestrated gathering. St. Mary Mead was quiet that afternoon, its usual serene facade tinged with an almost palpable tension. In the grand drawing-room of Wyvern House, the stage was set. The heavy drapes were drawn, casting the room in soft shadows that made it feel more like a waiting room than a place of grand family history. The smell of old furniture and faint traces of tobacco lingered in the air, an unmistakable hint of decay beneath the polished surfaces. Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, her knitting abandoned, her eyes focused on the group gathered before her. She had requested this meeting, though it was hardly by her own name that it was summoned. Inspector Trevelyan had sent the formal invitations, the summons to each of the suspects. The goal: a review of the new information Miss Marple had suggested regarding the half-burned pages of the letter. The gathering had been carefully orchestrated. As expected, Constance Blackwell, the matriarch of the house, entered first, her face a mask of composed disquiet. Behind her came Frederick Blackwell, his broad shoulders stiff with unease, followed by Miss Beatrice Soames, looking unusually flustered, her hands tightly clasped in front of her. Finally, Mr. Miles Havisham entered last, his presence cold and unreadable, as though the tension in the room didn't faze him in the slightest. Miss Marple greeted each one with a polite nod, though none of them met her eyes directly. She could sense the weight of suspicion hanging on each of them, each one wondering if they were about to be exposed. "Thank you for coming, all of you," Miss Marple said, her voice smooth, but with a firmness that invited no argument. "I do hope this doesn't inconvenience you. It's only that the matter at hand, well, it has become quite complicated. The letter, you see, has presented us with some new facts." There was a collective shift in the room, a subtle shift of weight and anticipation. Constance's hand rested on the back of the chair, her knuckles pale, Friedrich's jaw clenched visibly. Beatrice shifted uneasily, her eyes darting to the door, as though she might make an excuse and leave at any moment. Havisham, however, leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'm sure you're all aware of the importance of this letter," Miss Marple continued, her gaze flicking from face to face. "I do apologize for not revealing everything sooner, but it has come to my attention that there were pieces of the puzzle we hadn't fully understood. Now I think it's time we put everything together." Inspector Trevelyan, who had been standing quietly by the door, cleared his throat and stepped forward. He held a small, carefully folded piece of paper. Another fragment of the letter. "Here we have the remaining bit of the letter we found," Trevelyan announced, passing it to Miss Marple. She unfolded it with practiced fingers, her movements slow, deliberate. The room was unnervingly still, each suspect bracing for whatever was to come next. The piece of paper was singed at the edges, its text barely legible. Miss Marple read it aloud, her voice soft but clear. "The rightful claim, if proven, shall revert to—" There was a pause. The rest of the sentence was illegible, burnt away by the flames, but the damage had been done. "There it is," Miss Marple said, looking up from the paper. "A reference to the rightful claim, if proven. A statement that clearly implies someone else has the right to this estate. Someone who could take it away from Sir Roger or his heirs. This, I believe, is the crux of the matter." Constance shifted in her chair, her eyes darting toward Frederick, who had gone very still. Beatrice's hands trembled slightly, and Havisham remained as immobile as ever, though his eyes glinted with something sharp beneath the surface. Miss Marple allowed the tension to hang for a moment, watching their reactions carefully. She was a master of timing. This was where she would pull the thread and unravel the truth. "Now, if I may," Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but unyielding, "we know that Sir Roger had no legitimate claim to this estate beyond his name. The letter is clear on that. And we know that there was an illegitimate child, someone who could have taken that claim if the truth had been revealed." She turned her gaze to Beatrice Soames, who stiffened at the mention of the child. "It seems likely that this child would have had some connection to the Blackwell family. The question, of course, is who it might be." Beatrice swallowed hard, her face paling. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," she stammered. Her voice, though soft, carried an undertone of panic that couldn't be disguised. Miss Marple continued, undeterred. It's possible, Miss Soames, that you might be this illegitimate child, isn't it? Perhaps you've suspected it for some time. You see, it's only natural that someone in your position would have known about the letter. After all, it refers to someone's claim on the estate. If you were the one to inherit, it would make sense for you to act quickly to secure your place. Beatrice opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. Her gaze shifted from Miss Marple to Frederick, who was now glaring at her with what could only be described as barely contained hostility. "Miss Soames, is it true?" Miss Marple asked, her voice just above a whisper. "Are you the rightful heir?" The room was silent, save for the sound of a nervous breath from Beatrice, who slowly shook her head. I don't know what you're talking about." Miss Marple turned toward Frederick, her gaze sharp and calculating. "And you, Mr. Blackwell, what role did you play in all of this? You have so much to lose if the letter were to be found. It's clear to me that Sir Roger's death wasn't just a matter of inheritance. It was a matter of exposure. You didn't want anyone to learn the truth. But who could have known about it if not you?" Frederick's face twisted with a mixture of fury and fear. "I didn't," he began, his voice low and tense, but Miss Marple silenced him with a single glance. "No, Mr. Blackwell, I believe you. You didn't kill Sir Roger, but you knew that someone else might. Someone desperate enough to stop the letter from ever seeing the light of day." She turned to Havisham then, her voice steady. "And you, Mr. Havisham, what about you? What part did you play in this? You, too, had much to gain. If the letter was destroyed, the inheritance would pass to you, wouldn't it? You had just as much to lose as anyone else." Havisham shifted uncomfortably, his eyes narrowing. But he said nothing, letting the silence stretch on, his carefully constructed mask of indifference slipping for just a moment. Miss Marple let the moment hang in the air. There was only one more thing she needed, the final piece of evidence that would make everything fall into place. But she wasn't going to give it to them just yet, not until she had them exactly where she wanted them. The drawing room in Wyvern House was cold, even with the fire crackling in the hearth. It had the feeling of a room that had been used for all sorts of matters. Family gatherings, formal visits, even confrontations, the day it was used for something else. The furniture, too grand for comfort and too old to be fashionable, seemed to hold secrets in the upholstery, secrets that the house had grown used to keeping. But Miss Marple wasn't so easily fooled by appearances. As she sat quietly in her chair, knitting untouched in her lap, the suspects gathered round her, each one bracing for what was to come. Frederick Blackwell, with his sharp, rigid posture, Constance Blackwell, always composed but now pale with anxiety, Beatrice Soames, fidgeting with her gloves as though the weight of her own thoughts might crush her, and Miles Havisham, who leaned back in his chair, too calm for someone who was so clearly a part of the tangle. The tension in the room was thick, but Miss Marple took no notice of it. She wasn't looking for outbursts or confessions. She was watching the small, fleeting movements, the subtle reactions that only someone who knew people as well as she did could catch. "Now, my dears," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but cutting through the stillness like a needle through fabric, "we must get our facts straight. Let's go over the details of that afternoon again, shall we? I find it helpful to establish a clear timeline." She glanced at Constance first. "You, of course, were in the garden, weren't you, Mrs. Blackwell? Your usual afternoon walk among the roses?" Constance nodded slowly, though the edge of hesitation in her eyes didn't escape Miss Marple's notice. "Yes, I was in the garden. I spent a good while there tending to the flowers," she said, her voice steady but not without the smallest trace of defensiveness. "Quite so," Miss Marple replied, making a mental note. "And Frederick, I believe you were here at Wyvern House as well. You were in the drawing room when Sir Roger was alive." Frederick's eyes tightened at the mention of his name, his jaw clenching. "I was here, yes. I came for a visit. As I said before, I didn't see Sir Roger much, but I was certainly here." "Ah, and the tea," Miss Marple continued, her eyes never leaving his face. "You were the one who insisted on preparing it, weren't you, Mr. Blackwell?" The question hung in the air for a moment. and Frederick's breath seemed to catch in his chest, his hands clenched tightly at his sides, his knuckles white. "Yes, I prepared the tea," he said quickly, though the words seemed almost too rehearsed. "I didn't think there was any harm in it." "No harm, indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice light, but her eyes sharp. "The tea, of course, was a most unusual choice. I do wonder, though, why tea that afternoon, Mr. Blackwell? Sir Roger was a man of whiskey, not tea. Surely you must have known that." Frederick's face flushed. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand tapping restlessly on the arm of the chair. I thought it would be a nice change. Nothing more." Miss Marple let the silence stretch, her gaze unwavering. She turned her attention to Beatrice next, who had been sitting as quietly as possible, but her discomfort was written plainly on her face. "Miss Soames," Miss Marple said gently, "you, too, were out and about that afternoon, weren't you? You said you went to the post office, I believe." Beatrice nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I posted a letter. Just a letter to my aunt, nothing of importance." "A letter to your aunt," Miss Marple repeated, as if tasting the words. "And you're certain there was nothing else you needed to do, Miss Soames? Nothing you were concerned about, perhaps, regarding Sir Roger?" Beatrice's eyes flickered to the floor. "No, nothing at all, just the letter." Miss Marple studied her for a moment longer, but before she could ask anything more, she turned to Havisham, whose quiet air of detachment never wavered. "And you, Mr. Havisham, you arrived later in the day, didn't you?" Miss Marple's voice had a subtle steel to it now, as if she were pressing for something beneath the surface. "What was it you were doing when Sir Roger, well, when he was still with us?" Havisham gave her a measured look, the slightest edge of irritation flickering behind his eyes. "I arrived shortly before tea. I was in the study with Sir Roger, discussing some legal matters. Nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't see him after that. I didn't have much reason to stay longer." "So you didn't hear anything unusual, no arguments, no signs of distress?" "No," Havisham replied, his voice steady. "Nothing like that." Miss Marple let the silence fill the room. "Interesting," she murmured to herself. Interesting indeed. As the group sat in silence, the puzzle pieces began to settle into place in Miss Marple's mind. There was something to the way each of them had spoken, each of them dancing around the key details, but it was Frederick's reaction that stood out. His agitation was too obvious to be ignored, too personal. The housekeeper's testimony, too, had confirmed something Miss Marple had suspected. Mrs. Potter had mentioned seeing Frederick rummaging through Sir Roger's desk drawers shortly after the death was discovered, and that had been the critical sip, the one that linked Frederick to something more than just a casual visitor to Wyvern House. "Mr. Blackwell," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade, "you were not only the one to prepare the tea, but also the one to inspect the desk afterwards, were you?" Frederick's face twitched, his fingers now drumming erratically on the arm of his chair. I didn't search it," he stammered, his voice rising. "I merely looked through it for papers that might have been needed. Sir Roger had many things, business matters." I'm sure Miss Marple interrupted smoothly. "But it's curious, isn't it? You, of all people, the one most familiar with the workings of the Blackwell estate, taking it upon yourself to handle Sir Roger's affairs just after his untimely death." The air in the room thickened. Frederick's eyes darted nervously to the others, and for the first time since the meeting had begun, Miss Marple saw a flicker of fear behind his tightly controlled mask. Miss Marple let the words linger, knowing that she had struck the right chord. She wasn't ready to make her final move, not yet, but the pieces were aligning. Frederick Blackwell had the most to lose and the most to hide. His own words, his actions, and the way he had danced around the simple question of the tea had told her all she needed to know. But she was no fool. There were still others in this room with motives, still threads to be pulled, lies to be uncovered. Miss Marple knew that she would need just one more piece of evidence to tie it all together, something that would expose the guilty party once and for all. For now, though, she would wait. The trap had been set, the game was almost over. The afternoon was still. the kind of stillness that clung to every corner of St. Mary Mead like a heavy fog. The large manor homes stood like watchful sentinels, their windows dark and brooding, the air around them thick with the weight of history and secrets. In the drawing-room of Wyvern House, the sharp social divide of the village had been brought together, each suspect wearing their own version of civility like a thin veneer, cracked just enough for Miss Marple to see the truths lurking beneath. Constance Blackwell, ever the picture of control, was the first to speak. She sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers clenched around the edge of the armrest as if holding herself together by sheer force of will. Her eyes darted toward Frederick, but only briefly before she turned her attention back to Miss Marple. "Frederick," she said, her voice low and tight, "is my nephew. He has his faults, but I won't believe he had anything to do with Roger's death. He's never been the same since his father died. He's been lost, you see, lost in this business with the estate." Her words seemed rehearsed, a well-worn defense that barely held together. Miss Marple noticed the slight quiver in Constance's voice, the almost imperceptible way her eyes avoided the others in the room. She wasn't fully convinced by her own words, and Miss Marple was certain that, deep down, she wasn't entirely sure of Frederick's innocence. "But his frequent visits," Miss Marple pressed, her tone gentle but unyielding, "and his hostility towards Sir Roger? Surely you must have been confused by it?" Constance's fingers twitched, but she said nothing for a moment, as though weighing the words carefully before letting them slip out. "Yes," she finally admitted, her voice catching slightly. "I suppose I was. Frederick, he's never been comfortable around Roger, but it's been worse these past few months, more tense, more aggressive. He didn't like how Roger handled things, and I suppose I didn't understand it all." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her gaze never leaving Constance's face. "It's a terrible thing to feel so at odds with someone you're tied to by blood, but I do wonder, Mrs. Blackwell," Miss Marple continued, her voice almost too soft. "What was it that made Frederick so desperate? Was it just the inheritance, or was there something more?" Constance swallowed, her face betraying the faintest hint of something darker beneath her calm exterior. "I don't know," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I don't know." The silence that followed was thick with uncertainty, and all eyes turned to Beatrice Soames, who had been sitting quietly, her hands nervously twisting her gloves. Her pale face flushed slightly as she shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of the questions being aimed in her direction. "I've told you before," Beatrice said, her voice shaky but firm. "The telegrams had nothing to do with the Blackwell estate. I have no interest in it. My aunt's inheritance was a small matter, nothing that could have possibly affected Sir Roger or the family." Her words rang with the kind of defensiveness that Miss Marple had grown accustomed to hearing. It was a standard line, the kind that meant Beatrice was trying to hide something, or was perhaps telling the truth, though the latter seemed less likely with each passing moment. "And yet, Miss Soames," Miss Marple began slowly, her eyes never leaving Beatrice's face, "you were in such a hurry the day Sir Roger was found dead. You left the post office clutching that telegram, as though it might slip away if you didn't hold on to it tightly. Tell me, was it really about your aunt?" Beatrice flinched, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her gloves. "Yes, it was about my aunt," she repeated more insistently now. "I've told you. I don't know what more you want me to say. There's nothing to it." But Miss Marple saw the twitch in Beatrice's hands, the way she avoided direct eye contact when she spoke. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Beatrice was hiding something. The question was whether it had anything to do with Sir Roger's death, or if it was merely a distraction from the real story. Finally, Miss Marple turned her attention to Miles Havisham, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the exchange. He had leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his face as unreadable as ever, but Miss Marple had been watching him, and she noticed the subtle paling of his complexion, the slight tremor in his hands when he adjusted his glasses. The man was more unnerved than he let on. "Mr. Havisham," Miss Marple said, her voice light but firm, "you've been quite calm through all of this, I must say, but I can't help but wonder, Do you really think Sir Roger's death was just a matter of the debt he owed you? Havisham's gaze shifted briefly to Frederick before returning to Miss Marple, his jaw tightening. "I've said it before," he replied, his voice clipped. "I had no interest in Sir Roger's death. I only wanted to settle the debt. It was a business matter, nothing more. I didn't want harm to come to him, despite what some of you may think." Miss Marple smiled, just a fraction, noting the pale flush creeping up Havisham's neck. He was far too defensive about his lack of involvement, and his insistence on Sir Roger's debt seemed almost too rehearsed. It was clear he was hiding something. "You see, Mr. Havisham," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but piercing, "there's a certain way people react when they've been cornered. They either act out or they hold their ground. But your reaction, Mr. Havisham, is a little different. It's almost as though you're waiting for something else to come to light, something you're trying to prevent from being discovered." The subtle shift in Havisham's posture told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. He wasn't just a man concerned about his money, he was worried about what would happen if the truth came out about his involvement, or lack thereof, in the events leading up to Sir Roger's death. Miss Marple took a long, steady breath. The room was quiet, but it was a quiet thick with fear and anticipation. The air around her crackled with tension, each person in the room playing their part in the game they thought they were winning. But Miss Marple knew better. Frederick Blackwell had been desperate, cornered by his own need for approval and inheritance. Constance, though protective of her nephew, was starting to unravel under the pressure of the truth. Beatrice, who had hoped to remain unnoticed, was now tied too closely to the family's dark history. And Havisham, well, his role was clear but not yet fully understood. Each of them had a piece of the puzzle, but none of them held the key to the whole truth. Miss Marple could feel it in her bones. She was almost there. But she needed one more piece to make it all fall into place. She stood up, her movements calm, and smiled politely at her guests. "Thank you for your patience," she said, her voice carrying the weight of everything that had been said, and everything that hadn't. "I believe we've gotten quite far today, but I'm afraid the final part of this puzzle will take a little more time." The room fell silent, but Miss Marple knew it wouldn't be long before the truth came out. The pieces were all on the table now, and soon the web of lies would collapse under its own weight. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The flickering light seemed to only heighten the stillness, which now stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, knitting abandoned in her lap, as the gathered suspects shifted in theirs, each one teetering on the edge of some unspoken understanding, each one waiting for something to happen. Constance Blackwell's gaze was locked on her nephew, Frederick, whose face was taut with barely contained anxiety. Beatrice Soames sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze darting between the others. Miles Havisham remained, as always, an immovable presence, though Miss Marple could see the way his eyes flicked nervously toward the door ever so often. None of them spoke. The silence was more oppressive than any accusation. Miss Marple's voice, soft but clear, cut through the tension like a scalpel. "I've listened carefully," Miss Marple began, her tone polite, almost too gentle. "I've heard your alibis, your denials, and your explanations, but in the end it always comes down to one thing, the truth. And the truth, my dear friends, is that one of you killed Sir Roger Blackwell." Her eyes swept the room, briefly meeting each person's gaze. She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. "Let us begin with the motive," Miss Marple said, her voice steady as she spoke. Frederick Blackwell was afraid of losing everything, his claim to the estate, his position, his future. The letter that had been partially burned in the fireplace was a threat to his inheritance. A letter that could have proven that Sir Roger's claim was never valid, that there was someone else, someone who had a better right to the estate. Frederick shifted in his seat, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his lips parted as though to protest. but Miss Marple silenced him with a single raised hand. "The letter, Mr. Blackwell, was not just a scrap of paper to you," Miss Marple continued. "It was a ticking clock. And when you saw that Sir Roger was about to die, it was your one chance to make sure that letter stayed destroyed." The room was still. Beatrice and Constance exchanged uneasy glances, but Frederick remained silent, his face flushed, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "Now," Miss Marple said, shifting slightly in her chair, "we come to opportunity. Sir Roger was a man of routine. A man who drank whiskey, always whiskey, but on that afternoon, when he died, someone decided he would drink tea instead. Someone who was familiar with Sir Roger's habits, someone who knew that the simple act of offering tea could go unnoticed." She turned to Frederick, her eyes steady and unwavering. "You, Mr. Blackwell, were the one who prepared the tea, weren't you?" Frederick's face went pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He swallowed hard, a nervous gesture that didn't escape Miss Marple's notice. "You knew Sir Roger would never suspect," Miss Marple went on, her tone unshaken. "You knew he wouldn't think twice about a cup of tea, something so ordinary, so harmless. And it was in that tea that you placed the poison." The silence in the room thickened as the implication sank in. Frederick's hands shook now, but he still said nothing. Miss Marple continued, undeterred by his silence. "Poison, of course, is the means by which we arrive at the truth," she said. "It was a slow-acting poison, something tasteless, something that could be slipped into a drink with no suspicion, a poison that worked slowly enough to appear natural, but with enough lethality to take Sir Roger's life." Miss Marple let the words hang for a moment, before pressing on, her gaze now turning toward the last piece of the puzzle. "And then there's the final piece, the housekeeper's statement." She turned to Mrs. Potter, who had already revealed that Frederick had been seen rummaging through Sir Roger's desk shortly after his death. Frederick's frantic search through the drawers was not a simple matter of concern for lost papers, no, it was something much more specific. He was looking for the letter. He was trying to destroy the last remaining piece of it. He couldn't let it survive. Not when it could so easily take everything away from him. Frederick's face twisted in something between anger and fear, but still he said nothing. The weight of Miss Marple's words settled over him like a blanket. "And so, it all makes sense now," Miss Marple said, leaning forward slightly in her chair, her eyes never leaving Frederick's face. "You had everything to gain from Sir Roger's death, Mr. Blackwell. The letter threatened to expose you, to strip away your claim to the estate. The tea gave you the perfect opportunity to silence Sir Roger, to ensure that the truth remained buried." She sat back, her voice softening but still clear. "And yet, it wasn't just the letter that you were trying to destroy, was it, Mr. Blackwell? It was the past. The secrets that had been hidden for so long, the things that could have torn apart your world. So you acted. You poisoned your uncle not just for his money, but for your place in the world." The room was quiet now, save for the faint crackle of the fire. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the gathered suspects, her gaze sharp but not unkind. Constance looked as though she were about to faint, while Beatrice's gaze remained fixed on her lap, her hands trembling slightly. Havisham, though, was the one who stood out. He looked as though he were about to bolt for the door. "You see, Mr. Havisham," Miss Marple said, addressing him directly for the first time, "you may have thought you had a stake in all of this, but you were never in danger of losing your money, were you? No, it wasn't the debt that mattered to you, it was the letter, too. It was the possibility that it might expose something you didn't want anyone to know. That you were, perhaps, closer to this matter than you let on." Havisham's face tightened, his jaw muscles working as he fought to maintain his composure. I didn't want harm to come to Roger. I merely wanted to settle the debt." His voice faltered, but Miss Marple had already moved past him, her eyes once more locked on Frederick. "You, Mr. Blackwell, acted in desperation, but the truth has a way of surfacing. The letter, the tea, the poison. It all pointed to you." She took a deep breath, then finally allowed a slight, knowing smile to play at the corner of her lips. You may have tried to bury the past, Mr. Blackwell, but it was always there, waiting to be uncovered. Frederick sank into his chair, the fight gone from him. His hands trembled in his lap and his gaze shifted nervously from one person to the next, but no one spoke. The evidence had been laid bare, and there was no escape now. Miss Marple stood, her movements deliberate, her gaze firm. She had done her work, the case was closed. The room was unnaturally still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside, the evening air was cool, a stark contrast to the warmth inside Wyvern House, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. The room, with its thick drapes and heavy furniture, had always felt like a place for solemn gatherings. But tonight it was different. Tonight, it was the stage for the final act. Frederick Blackwell sat at the edge of his chair, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. His eyes flicked from Miss Marple to the others in the room, his expression a mix of fear and defiance. The others, Constance, Beatrice, and Havisham, sat in tense silence, waiting for the next move. But it was Frederick who was the center of attention now, and he knew it. Miss Marple had given him no choice. The trap had been set, the pieces laid out, and now there was nowhere left to hide. Frederick's breath hitched as he finally spoke, his voice strained. "You don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "I couldn't let him, Roger, find out about the letter. I couldn't. I knew what he would do." His hands clenched tighter, as though trying to grasp control of something slipping through his fingers. Miss Marple's eyes never left him, her gaze steady and unyielding. "What was it that you were afraid of, Mr. Blackwell?" Frederick shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked around the room, avoiding direct eye contact, his words coming in fragmented bursts. "The inheritance, it was always going to be his. I never stood a chance. But the letter, it changed everything. Once Roger saw that, he'd disinherit me. He'd expose me as a fraud. It was all over." His voice cracked, the desperation clear. Miss Marple nodded slowly, as if she had known all along. "So you took matters into your own hands, did you?" Frederick's face twisted with a grimace. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said, his voice rising in pitch, panic creeping in. "I just wanted him to fall unconscious, to stop reading the letter. I thought, if he didn't know, if I destroyed it—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. "But I couldn't destroy it all. I had to act quickly." His hands trembled now, the full weight of his guilt finally settling in. "I put poison in the tea. It was the only way." He looked around the room as though hoping someone might rescue him. But the only sound that filled the space was the soft crackle of the fire. No one moved, no one spoke. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Frederick continued, his voice breaking. "But then Roger saw what I was doing. He saw the letter, tried to burn it. He grabbed part of it from the flames. I don't know what happened next, but I didn't stop him. I didn't stop him from reading it, and then when I saw him, I knew it was too late." Miss Marple let the silence stretch on for a moment longer before she spoke again, her voice soft but resolute. "And that's when you found him, wasn't it? Half conscious, with the torn piece of the letter near him. A final piece of evidence that you tried to destroy." Frederick closed his eyes as if trying to block out the truth. But Miss Marple's words were too much to deny. The confession hung in the air between them, suffocating him with its finality. Constance Blackwell's face was pale, her hands trembling in her lap. She hadn't said a word since Frederick had begun his confession, and now, hearing it all laid bare, she looked as though the weight of the world had suddenly been placed upon her shoulders. "Frederick?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper. I didn't know." The words trailed off, swallowed by the heavy silence that followed. Beatrice Soames, who had been sitting rigidly beside Constance, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She glanced at Frederick, then quickly averted her gaze as though afraid to make eye contact. Her hands, still clasped tightly in her lap, seemed to tremble more than before. Havisham, for his part, said nothing. His face was impassive, his sharp eyes never leaving Frederick. But the faint twitch in his jaw betrayed his discomfort. He had always been a man of business, calculating, careful. But now even he couldn't hide the tension in his posture. He had known something was off about Frederick, but hearing it all laid bare was something else entirely. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, as she walked to the fire for a moment. The room was heavy with the weight of the revelation, and she let the silence linger, knowing it would be the last thing Frederick wanted. She turned back to the group, her eyes never leaving Frederick's. "It's an unfortunate thing, Mr. Blackwell. Desperation is often the driving force behind the worst decisions. You thought you could control the situation, that you could stop the truth from coming out. But in the end, the truth always finds its way to the surface." She allowed a brief, almost imperceptible pause before continuing, her voice soft but carrying the weight of finality. "You poisoned Sir Roger, Mr. Blackwell. You watched him suffer, thinking you could stop the truth from being revealed, but instead you've only hastened its arrival." Frederick stared at her, his face pale, his lips parted in shock. There was nothing left for him to say. The room had fallen silent, the tension now replaced by a somber inevitability. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the others in the room. Constance, still sitting there in stunned silence, her eyes wide as though trying to come to terms with the confession. Beatrice, whose fingers were now twisted together, her expression a mix of confusion and guilt. Havisham, who hadn't moved since the confession had started, but whose stiff posture suggested a man who had heard enough to know that the truth had been exposed. "The matter is resolved," Miss Marple said simply, turning to the group. "But it is a sad thing to witness, isn't it? A man so desperate to hold on to something that was never truly his to begin with. Greed and fear clouding his judgment until there was no turning back." She paused again, letting the weight of her words sink in. Sir Roger Blackwell's death wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't about money. It was about the fear of being exposed for what he truly was. Someone who had been living a lie. And in that fear, Mr. Blackwell, you made a choice. You chose to silence him, to stop the truth from ever coming to light. But as you can see, the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Miss Marple turned to the others, her voice growing softer, almost maternal. "It's done now. The matter is settled, and justice will be served. But the cost of it is always high, isn't it? For all of us." With that, she turned to leave the room, leaving the stunned group behind her. They would deal with the aftermath as they always did in Sir Mary Mead, but Miss Marple had done her part. The mystery had been solved, the pieces had fallen into place. And for Miss Marple that was enough. The drawing room had never felt more oppressive. The thick curtains drawn tight against the evening light seemed to draw in the very air around them. The fire, now reduced to glowing embers, cast long, jagged shadows across the faces of those still seated watching the inevitable unfold. The tension in the room was so thick it could be cut with a knife. And in the midst of it all, Miss Marple sat, calm as ever, her knitting once more resting in her lap. Inspector Trevelyan stood by the door, his broad shoulders stiff, his expression unreadable as he looked at Frederick Blackwell. The man was no longer defiant. There was no fight left in him. The desperation that had clung to him for days had evaporated, replaced now by a hollow resignation. He had confessed, and there was no turning back. "Mr. Frederick Blackwell," Inspector Trevelyan's voice was firm, but there was a faint tinge of sympathy, "you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Roger Blackwell." The words rang in the room, heavy and final. The others, caught in the throes of disbelief, looked on, stunned. Frederick's face had gone pale, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the reality that had finally come to claim him. The constable stepped forward, the handcuffs glinting briefly in the dim light before they snapped around Frederick's wrists. As the constable began to lead him away, the room seemed to contract, as though the very air had been sucked out by the finality of it all. Constance Blackwell's breath caught in her throat, and she gripped the arm of her chair, as if trying to anchor herself against the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Frederick," Constance's voice cracked, the word barely escaping her lips as she reached out a hand, her face a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. How could you do this?" But Frederick did not respond. His eyes, once full of anger and fear, were now blank. It was as though he had already shut down, resigned to whatever fate awaited him. He offered no apology, no remorse. Just a hollow look as he was escorted from the room. Miss Marple did not flinch. Her gaze remained steady, her mind already moving on to the next moment. She turned to Constance, whose tears were starting to well up, though she fought them back with an almost painful stoicism. Miss Marple rose and moved to Constance's side, her voice gentle but firm. "It's a difficult thing, Mrs. Blackwell, to lose a brother and then a nephew in such a short span of time, but sometimes the weight of secrets is too much for people to bear. Frederick's actions weren't entirely his own, I believe. There was too much fear in him. Fear of losing everything." Constance, her face pale and drawn, nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes. She spoke quietly, as though the words were being drawn out of her against her will. "I knew he was troubled, but I never thought that he would go so far. All these years, and I never truly knew him." She shook her head, the full weight of her grief settling in. "I failed him. I should have seen it." Miss Marple placed a hand gently on Constance's arm, her voice steady, a soft reassurance in the storm. "You did your best, Mrs. Blackwell. That's all anyone can do." Constance sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. "But it wasn't enough, and now Roger's dead, my brother is gone, and my nephew—" Her voice trailed off, the enormity of it all sinking in. Meanwhile, Beatrice Soames sat, her back stiff and her hands still trembling, but now there was a sense of relief in her posture. The fear that had clung to her for days seemed to lift with each passing moment. The weight of suspicion had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, catching Miss Marple's eye, I've been meaning to tell you, the telegrams. They weren't about the Blackwell estate, I swear it. They were about an inheritance from my aunt. It's a small matter, something that's been pending for a while now." She swallowed hard, her voice faltering. "I didn't know how to explain it, but I've been afraid you might think it had something to do with all of this." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze understanding but still sharp. "I understand, Miss Soames, and I believe you. The weight of suspicion can make it difficult to speak clearly, to tell the truth without hesitation." Beatrice gave a small, relieved nod. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't want anyone to think. But now it's all over." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. "It's over, Miss Soames. For you at least." Havisham, who had been sitting silently through the exchange, finally spoke, his voice flat and resigned. "It seems we've all been caught up in something that was beyond our control. I've no interest in seeing anyone suffer needlessly, but there are matters of business to be dealt with now." His expression hardened briefly, and Miss Marple could sense the remnants of his own anxiety over the financial mess that had followed in the wake of Sir Roger's death. "Of course, Mr. Havisham," Miss Marple replied gently. "The estate will need to be sorted out, but I believe that's for another day. For now, we can leave it in the hands of the authorities. Justice has been served."